Long ago, the
Cabbages.
lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the
Avatar.
attacked.
Oh, my cabbages! My cabbages! My cabbages! Ah, my cabbages! My Oh, forget it!
He was a humble merchant of low beginnings. He overcame adversity, his property, his livelihood, destroyed repeatedly by the vicious Avatar and his gang of ruffians. But he rose higher than anyone else, to the point he even had a statue made of him in Republic City, a beacon to all others of hope, that even the lowest of us can rise high. We are, of course, talking about the cabbage merchant. But his story does raise an interesting question. How and why does he remain in the cabbage business? Just trust me, this will be more interesting than you think, if you're a nerd like me, which you are, and I know you are because you've been watching my channel. Don't be ashamed of it, revel in it. Revel in the fact that you are watching videos on the economic theory behind Avatar: The Last Airbender, one of the greatest shows ever made, if not the greatest. So in economics, the two governing concepts are supply and demand. Supply being all about how much of a good can be produced, and demand being about how much people want of that good. For example, we all want diamonds, but they're difficult to find, they cost to mine, and then they have to be refined into jewelry. Because of this, there is a low supply, but a very high demand, and it's because of this that the price is relatively high. Now at the beginning, before his tragic Shakespearean tale began, there was enough demand to keep the cabbage merchant in business, and cabbages were easy enough to supply that he could meet that demand. The market was in equilibrium, and he was able to make a profit. At least that's what they call it in economics, equilibrium, which is also an underrated sequel to The Matrix. But the events of the show introduce another element to the cabbage merchant's business that we need to factor in: economic risk. Economic risk is the idea that factors outside the seller's control will affect the supply or demand of a good. For example, there is a big safety risk in working on an oil rig, making the supply of oil more difficult because they have to pay people more to work there. And so as we enter into this tragic Shakespearean tale, the market for cabbages begins to change across the series. In his opening episode, The King of Omashu, the Cabbage Man's stock was destroyed 3 times. Once by the Earth Kingdom guards, and twice by Team Avatar. And at 3 later points across the series, his cabbage assets are tragically destroyed, leaving nothing but dust in the wind. Leafy, green dust in the wind. Now there are 2 parts to consider to economic risk: the probability of that risk and the impact of that risk. Now this happens 6 times in the space of a year to the cabbage merchant, and it's implied to have wiped out all of his major assets as a travelling cabbage merchant, both the cart and the cabbages. He was left alone with nothing but the clothes on his back, all of his green friends dead, lost in this massacre. Oh my cabbages, oh my cabbages indeed. So what has changed here? Well, where once the cabbage market had a low economic risk and thus low supply costs, the economic risk has risen, and thus the cost of supplying cabbages has risen. These extra costs could have come from him needing to hire security to protect his assets from the Avatar, or from him needing to buy insurance. We know that ancient markets like in Rome and China, they had insurance businesses, and in this new economic climate, it's not unlikely that the cabbage merchant would have invested in an insurance policy. This would also explain why he had the funds for a whole new cart and a whole new stock of cabbages in Tales of Ba Sing Se when his cart was destroyed just a few days earlier in the Serpent's Pass. And these new supply costs arising from economic risk are eventually factored into the overall price and passed on to consumers. But the question becomes, how does the cabbage merchant actually stay in business? Well, this is where the true tragic tale begins, where everything turns dark, where he begins to lose everything, even hope that things could get better. The thing is that the cabbage travelling cart market is one with low barriers to entry, which means it's relatively easy for anyone to set up a business that travels around the world selling cabbages. But this does mean that our merchant, who has been knocked down again and again by the Avatar and his evil friends, and yet he has gotten up every single time and tried again, that our merchant will be competing with a lot of other people in the same market. But the curious thing is that the economic risk that our cabbage merchant faces at the hands of the Avatar doesn't seem to be widespread. Or at least he doesn't believe it is. In The Rift, he exclaims upon seeing Aang that bad things always happen to my cabbages when you're around. He feels it's specific to him. He's somewhat superstitious about it, meaning that the extra insurance he's had to buy, the security he's had to hire, and the supply of cabbages that he's had to repurchase are supply costs that no other travelling cabbage cart merchants have had to face. This makes him less competitive in the marketplace, and this may also explain why he travels so much around the Earth Kingdom. He's seeking out newer niche markets where there is less competition, so he can make a profit. But eventually, the war comes for everyone, and he was forced to flee, like so many others, as the Fire Nation spread across the Earth Kingdom, behind the walls of Ba Sing Se. He couldn't defend himself, not like the Avatar, who didn't even care to save his poor cabbages, his livelihood. Oh no. No, he was too grand for that. He arrives at Full Moon Bay, seeking refugee status to get into the capital, hiding from the war like thousands of others. It was here that his only green companions were destroyed once more, and the Avatar was there. And what did he do? He stood by and watched. What has happened to the private property in this nation? What has happened to the rights of the vulnerable? But eventually he ends up in Ba Sing Se, and the problem here is that it's such a large marketplace, probably free of government regulation.
There's no war
that can harm local businesses
in Ba Sing Se.
And before we explain how this forces him out of business, we need to talk about elasticity. Elasticity is how much people want to buy something in response to a rise or fall in price. For example, the demand for petrol is relatively inelastic. Even if the price goes up a little bit, we still buy relatively the same amount. But the demand for a particular kind of petrol is actually quite elastic. If the price of a particular brand of petrol goes up, then most people are relatively happy to switch to another. Now, demand in the travelling cabbage cart market is probably relatively inelastic. When it comes to vegetables, we tend to buy roughly the same amount, even if the prices go up a little bit. But if the price of a particular brand, like our cabbage seller, goes up, then cabbage buyers tend to very happily switch to another seller. With all these changes and the new supply costs to his personal business and nobody else in a free market economy, our sad cabbage merchant probably can't compete at all in Ba Sing Se. And this is why he is eventually forced to change business strategies, having to leave the job that he so loves and try something else. We learn in The Rift that our glorious hero takes on a brave new step, a new venture into the capitalist world, and he leaves the travelling cabbage cart market behind and sets up a new business, a restaurant. A cabbage-focused restaurant, though, with cabbage cookies, cabbage noodles, and cabbage soup. He runs a highly specialised business and knows cabbage cooking extremely well. This decision may have actually decreased his supply costs because he didn't have to hire security, or having his business based on private property, it is less likely to be vandalised than it would be in a public place, like his cart was, lowering both security and insurance rates. And it's here that we see his innovative drive. The merchant is trying to be a pioneer in a new market, to carve out a niche for himself, an instinct that capitalism rewards. But once again, our merchant's tale takes a turn for the worse, when all he has ever wanted to do is earn a living off the sweat on his back, and his business doesn't start off that well. His business is empty at lunchtime, and he notes to Aang that business has been slow. Who would have thought that cabbage cookies and cabbage noodles weren't quite the liveliest market? Unfortunately, it appears that the demand in this new market for cabbage noodles and cabbage cookies is relatively low, which once again puts him in dire financial straits. It's like reading The Merchant of Venice. Soon I'll be hearing him give up a pound of flesh. And though our hero is in his darkest hour, all around him seems black. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. All around him is shadows and dust, reduced to ash, his dreams. All of this changes when he meets Satoru, the inventor of the forklift. At the end of The Rift, our genius innovator, who has once again gotten up off the ground after being beaten down by life and left with nothing, he becomes an investor, and he asks to partner with Satoru after he sees this remarkable machine, his forklift. And it's here that we see the entrance of a concept called the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the cost of not doing something else. It's the value of your next best alternative. For example, if I go out with friends, then I'm not making a video, which costs me money in the long run. For our adventurous cabbage merchant, the opportunity cost of remaining in the cabbage business is not taking up this private venture with Satoru and his forklift. But our hero, after his countless defeats, after he has become jaded and weary with the world, he has grown wise. And with his marked financial prowess, the merchant decides to convert his assets and existing capital and begin Cabbage Corp. And it's here he begins to participate in the technological revolution and manufacture automobiles. This turns out to be a resounding success because of something called the first mover advantage. This is where the first person in a market tends to earn a lot more than those who come later. We see how high the demand for cars quickly becomes in Republic City, let alone the rest of the world. And to start with, they are the only suppliers. They have a monopoly, meaning they don't have to compete with anyone else. Because of this, the price is high, and our lowly merchant, at last, makes a fortune. He is given his dues, and he can speak to the Avatar. Oh, how the Avatar dismissed him as nothing more than a civilian, a peasant, a nobody. But he wouldn't do it anymore, would he? No, he wouldn't. Satoru and the merchant maintain their monopoly, partly because they retain the trade secrets needed to build a motor or an engine like this, but also partly because of the high barriers to entry. So remember how we talked about before, there are low barriers to entry when it comes to getting into the cabbage cart business. Anyone can do it. Well, when it comes to manufacturing cars, there are high barriers to entry. You've got to have lots of capital, you've got to have a lot of contacts and resources available to you. This gives Cabbage Corp at least an initial first mover advantage against everyone else. This is also an example of what Schumpeter, an Austro-American economist, called the gale of creative destruction. That economic innovation requires essentially the destruction of the old in trying to find new ways to do things, places the slower forms of transport like the ostrich horse, and so comes to the end of our solemn tale. He overcame trial after trial. He endured solemn adversity. He went from lowly cabbage merchant, but he rose high, higher than anyone else, high with the skyline of Republic City. He went up to the skies, and he had his name plastered everywhere. And we all knew his name, the Cabbage Merchant. But that is not just who he is. It's the essence of innovation. It is the essence of invention. Good day. I've said the word cabbage way too many times in the last hour. I don't ever want to see a cabbage game. Please, just never mention cabbages. Don't type cabbages in the comments. That's a bad idea. Oh, my dad would be proud of me because he does economics and teaches it. And I got him to look over this script, and he would be very proud that I'm using economic concepts to explain a side character that was meant to appear in one episode and never again. On another note, I was on the Arrow podcast, my first time ever being on a podcast, and there's a link to listen to that. We talked about Zuko Alone, one of the best episodes in the whole series. Link to that down in the description below. Question of the day: who is your favourite side character that you've seen in a series before? Like the Cabbage Merchant, you know, just kind of a one-off, maybe they're a gimmick. My personal favourite is Sally Sparrow from Doctor Who. Might have had a crush on her. Don't judge me. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, you're a nerd, wonderful nerd, revel in it. Don't be ashamed. Stay nerdy, sub-viewers, and I will see you in the future.